A both fun and challenging time for the group was on the horizon. The majority of the group was in their junior year of high school, probably the toughest year of high school. On a gaming note, the great game Fortnite was starting to die off slowly, but NBA 2K19, a fun game in the group, was very loved, and there was 2 more games coming out that the group was extremely excited for: Red Dead Redemption and Call of Duty Black Ops 4. Lots of players in the group took a break from COD as World War II wasn't liked much and Fortnite was taking up most of the time, but Black Ops 4 was special. The group hasn't been this hyped for a COD, debatably ever. Coming off of the best zombies game of all time in BO3, the group, who were pros at speedrunning the Easter eggs on BO3, mainly Will, Jason, and Peter, were very excited for the zombies, and the multiplayer was something the group would also be excited for. Even doing a race for Dark Matter when BO4 eventually did come out, in which Will won, getting it within a week, followed shortly by Chris C. and Peter. The game was off to a great start, but even bigger things were on the way. Season 10, Black Ops 2, was yet another tournament that was supposed to be the last, but something special was brewing in the air, a feeling the group hasn't had since the old 360 days of playing COD. Parties would fill up, with lobbies getting constantly full and having to leave people out or split groups very often. Tensions were rising, as players would constantly 1v1 each other in sniping, and Nuketown, a fan favorite, was coming out shortly. This was the perfect time for a sniper tournament, and lots of people were on board. In fact, so many people that we would shoot for a 16-player tournament for the first time since the Season 4 AW tournament, which took place in 2015. Immediately, we would have a lot of returning faces from the last season. Peter, the reigning champ, Jason, the one-time champ, Adrian, another one-time champ, Trayvon, Chris C, Sammy, Craig, Mike, Shrev, and Dan. Now this would make up for 10 of the 16 slots, so there was still some work to do. But, immediately, players that have previously played would return, such as Gabe and Mattosh, loving BO4 so far. And some new players would also be entering. Matt R, a good friend of the group who didn't play much COD and would just casually play at times. And a friend of Craig's would also join, Alex. Now this would still leave 2 more slots. Now the hype for BO4 would bring back some previous competitors, but not just any previous competitors, legends. Josh, a player who used to be king in what felt like a very, very long time ago. Before the player he trained, Will, would take over, but Josh would be making a return for the Season 11 tournament as he started to get back in COD with the release of BO4. And lastly, a player who was so good, a player who would strike fear in the competitors in the tournament, a player who is highly involved in the GOAT debate, and the only player ever in tournament and non-tournament games to destroy Will in a sniper 1v1, Christian. This would completely shift how the tournament would go, and the commish, Will, knew he had to take drastic measures to make sure this tournament would not flop, just like Season 4 did. The commish, Will, for years was sick and tired of the current double elimination bracket, and knew, with all of these legends coming back to play, the current bracket wouldn't get the full potential of this tournament, so Will and Peter would come up with the amazing divisions bracket. Let me explain. There would be 16 players in the tournament. Each division would randomly be split up into 4 players. Each player would play each other 1 time for a total of 3 games, and the playoffs would be a total of 8 players. And pretty much the best records from 1 to 8 would be sorted as such, and KD ratio would be the tiebreaker for records. The playoff games themselves would be all best of 3 games, and the finals would be the same best of 3 format, but the score would be up to 30 for the finals. With that being said, the randomizer would go underway. The first division would be a fun and funny division, a division where arguably the 2 best players and the 2 worst players were in. Jason, a player who is very good and a one-time champion, but has started to fall off recently, but would still be a threat nonetheless. Dan, who is Dan, and would have a very interesting story coming into this tournament. A player who has been laughably bad, but would miraculously make a playoff appearance in the last season, but he would lose 20-1. Yes, 20-1, versus Jason. This would piss Dan off. So much, in fact, that he went out and spent upwards of $1,000+ on gaming equipment and would ask Will to train him to get revenge on Jason. Matt R, making his tournament debut, a casual player who doesn't play much COD, and Adrian, the favorite to win the tournament, and a player who came off a semi-disappointing season last season, losing in the semifinals to Sammy, but still the current best and favorite to win it all yet again. This division would be named the Hail Marys, as a group decision because of the miracles of 3 of the 4 players would conjure up. Jason being the comeback king, Adrian being one of the worst snipers to the best in a very short time, and Dan, reasons. The next division would be an odd one. All players would be question marks, as we had no clue on how far they would go in this one. Alex, Craig's friend, was a subpar player, making his debut. Sammy, a player who had just come off 2 back-to-back finals losses and is 0-4 in the finals all time, would slowly start to give up on his tourney winning dreams, not playing much of BO4. Christian, by far the biggest mystery of the entire tournament. While he is known as either the 2nd or 3rd best player of all time, debatably the 1st, and coming off of a crazy blowout win versus Will himself in their last tournament, and his skill, as we know, is top tier, and he just came off the best season of all time. But that was almost 3 years ago, and Christian, as great as he is, would undoubtedly be rusty on controller, as he switched over to PC in that time span. And Christian would be playing against players that would be actively playing on controllers for years, so it would be some challenge for him. And lastly, Mike, one of the strangest players of all time. 1-6 in his career overall, but a player who would play fairly well and compete in close affairs with top players, but also plays really badly and loses in close games to very bad players as well. A very weird sniper. This division would be called the Finesse Gods, as Christian was mainly responsible for coming up with the names, as other players didn't really care on the division name. Our 3rd division was debatably the strongest all-around division, between this one and the next one. Chris C, a player who is actually the 2nd highest favorite to win the tournament, being completely undefeated so far in private match sniper 1v1s, mainly playing against players such as Peter, Jason, Craig, Trayvon, Gabe, Josh, Matt R, and Alex. Chris C has completely transformed his game, coming off of 2 very disappointing seasons, not making the playoffs in either, but wanting to go back to his days of competing in the semis and the finals, and was a huge threat in this tournament. Trayvon, a player whose glory days were long past him, and was kinda just in tournaments just to be in them, but was still naturally a solid player. Gabe, another strong candidate to win the division, a solid player who has plans of creating a pro team in this COD, and would play very actively. And Matosh, probably the unluckiest player of all time, with brutal past schedules in his tournament days, even playing against Fation, Will, and Christian in back-to-back-to-back games, the 3 best snipers of all time. Also, playing against Jacob, probably the 4th or 3rd best. He would just need to play Adrian to complete the top 5 players of all time gauntlet, but Matosh would finally be getting a chance in this one, having a decent chance versus Trayvon, not a great chance admittedly versus Chris C, but also knowing Gabe well as they would play together quite often. This division would be called the Jerkies, mainly Chris C and Gabe coming up with a name. Our last division would be a very interesting one. Josh, once the best player so long ago, would be fairly disappointing in tournaments, but coming off probably his best season in Season 5, his last season, losing in the semis to Will. Josh, just like Christian however, would be fairly rusty, but Josh would still be solid and have the 6th highest odds of winning the tournament, but looked like a shell of his former self, and would really need to prove himself in a tournament for once. Peter, our reigning champ, and one of the craziest plot twists of all time. Forever a mediocre player who would barely squeak in the playoffs would suddenly win a championship, and would actually have to be respected as a player. Peter, however, would only have the 5th highest odds of winning this one. Craig, a player who was decent and just came off a playoff appearance, but would have the 10th highest odds of winning this one, as the competition level was a lot larger in this tournament. But Craig wouldn't be an easy out for players, as he was constantly camping behind the Craig car on Nuketown. And lastly, Trev, who is probably one of the 2 worst players of all time with Siddharth, and a player who has 0 career wins. This division was called the Bully Boys, mainly due to Peter and Craig's enforcing leadership in NBA 2K Pro Am, and Josh a little bit. Just a quick pause, I just want to explain how I did the randomizer. So basically, I just wrote names on sticky notes and I put them in a hat, And pretty much what I did is I would draw a name from a hat, and they would be placed in one division, and then the next name would be placed in the other division, and so on. So basically, the first 4 people that I pulled were all in separate divisions, and then the 5th person that I pulled would be in the first division, if that makes sense. That's the best way I can explain it, just so you guys aren't confused by, like, the times, because technically the first person I pulled was Jason, then it was Taher, who was supposed to be in the tournament, but he wasn't, and he got replaced. So, yeah, and he got replaced for Alex, by the way, so that is why Alex is in the division. Just to clarify that. Anyways, back to the video. The tournament was set, and we were underway in one of our most anticipated tournaments of all time. Round 1, and our season opener, had the reigning champ Peter playing against the infamous car camper Craig. Peter was a solid favorite in this game, and the two would play in World War II, which saw Peter winning easily by a score of 20-13, and Peter was a much better player in BO4, so it'd be a nice win for Peter, right? Wow, one match, one upset. Peter looking awful in this one, and not being able to compete with the Craig car at all, losing 20-13, getting slightly destroyed, and long-term best friend of Peter, Jason, would make fun of him a lot for losing this game against Craig, saying, "Oh, how do you lose to someone that's always just in one spot?" This would be a bad loss for Peter, as he would have to win the next 2 games to have a decent shot at the playoffs. Our next match would be in the Hail Marys division, and would be a very highly anticipated match between Dan and Jason. Now you may be thinking, why is this highly anticipated? Well, Dan, after many weeks of training, and now having $1,000+ spent on gaming equipment just to beat Jason, should make this one a closer affair, right?
No.
No. Jason, in similar fashion to Season 10, would destroy Dan, making this one of his most humiliating losses ever. Oh, just you wait. But hey, at least Dan got 5 times the kills he did from last time playing Jason, right? Our next match would also be in the same division, and would be a fairly boring match, with the current best player in the tournament going against the worst player in the tournament. But, a fun fact, Adrian is actually 0-5 in round 1 games, and that wouldn't matter at all. Adrian, though looking really shaky in this one, would go on to win this match easily, 20-11, but Adrian had bigger plans on the horizon. Moving on to the Jerkies division, and our next match would be a fairly lopsided match with Chris C, a very good player, playing against Matosh, a decent player who has had lots of misfortune in his tournament career. Chris C was a good player, but has just come off of 2 awful tournaments in a row, missing the playoffs in both, after just making 4 semifinals appearances in a row before that. It's safe to say, this was a huge bounce back game as Chris C looked better than ever, winning in dominant fashion, 20-4, looking to keep this dominance going, and Matosh would now have to have 2 great games to even have a prayer at the playoff spot. Mike, being a small favorite in this one, going against Alex, a new sniper, and this would be an interesting game for the wrong reasons. 2 below average snipers going at it, but Mike having flashes of success, but would finally be able to win a game for a change, right? This was one of the most painful games to watch, despite it being a nail-biter. Both players playing awfully, seeming like both were playing to lose, but Mike would yet again disappoint, losing to Alex 20-19. Staying in the division, we would have a very interesting game, Sammy versus Christian. Now, both of these players are historic legends, but both of them are in a lot different of a situation as they would normally be in. Sammy, coming off back-to-back finals losses, looking really good, but just not being able to finish the job, would be a decent underdog in this one as his care for COD has plummeted, not really playing much of BO4, but Sammy would actually be 1-0 versus Christian in his career, beating him in a crazy upset in the Season 3 AW tournament. But the times have changed since, and on the other side, we would finally get to see the god himself return, Christian. In his last season and game, he destroyed another god and Will, being the only player to do so ever. This would surely make him a massive favorite in any tournament, no? Well, Christian took a huge break from playing any game on controller, as you know, and is definitely rusty. While he got a little amount of practice in, he started the game off looking a little rusty, relying on the credit card a lot, and the game was going back and forth, being tied 10-10 at one point, but Christian would start to get a groove, ultimately going on a 10-2 run and winning the match 20-12, with some very weak opponents coming up next and a perfect opportunity to get his groove back. Just 2 more games left in round 1, and one of them would be a heavily lopsided game with Josh finally seeing his return, and he would be playing one of the 2 worst snipers of all time in Shrev. Josh would have an easy opportunity to show out in this one. Wow. Josh would ultimately continue his tournament struggles, even though he won, but barely, winning 20-18. This was an awful look for Josh, as he started the game off terribly, even losing at one point, and the game was even tied 17-17 against the awful Shrev. But Josh would close it out, but would need to improve fast if he wanted any chance of winning this tournament. Our last match of round 1 would be a solid game, with Gabe versus Trayvon. Gabe was a decent favorite in this one as he played a ton of BO4, while Trayvon would only play once in a blue moon, but we still were looking at a solid match. But, that didn't really happen. Gabe would start the match off on fire, looking really good, and even going up 17-6 at one point. Trayvon would make a nice run, but it was too little too late, and Gabe would close it out 20-12, looking forward to grabbing a playoff spot in the future. Round 1 ends, and so far, Chris C is the 1 seed, winning in a dominant 20-4 outing, with Jason and Adrian following behind. Christian and Gabe would be middle of the pack, both getting convincing wins. Craig also getting a convincing win, with Josh and Alex both barely sneaking in. Round 2 was underway, seasons were on the line for some players, and our first match was a rivalry that was just always bound to happen, in Chris C versus Trayvon. So far, Chris C was up 4-3 in the rivalry, with Trayvon winning their last 2 games, and also eliminating Chris C in their last 2 tournaments, but this was a whole different ballgame. And for the first time ever in this rivalry, there would be a dominant winner, with Chris C looking incredibly good in this tournament so far, winning yet again 20-4, eliminating Trayvon from the playoffs and clinching a playoff spot of his own, but Chris C was going for more than just the playoffs. Huge roadblock of the tournament, a not so fun time for the commish will. Alex, a new sniper and Craig's friend, who just came off a 20-19 win, who was playing Christian in round 2, would forfeit. Him and the commish will would get in a heated exchange, with Alex ultimately forfeiting the entire tournament. Anyways, our next 2 matches were all boring, lopsided games. Firstly, in the Hail Marys division, we would have Jason versus Matt R. Jason was expected to win this easily, and that is exactly what would happen, as Jason would dominate from start to finish, winning the match 20-7, clinching a playoff spot with a huge game versus Adrian ahead of him. In the Bully Boys division, we would have a reigning champ Peter versus Trev. Now Peter just came off of one of his worst losses ever, losing 20-13 to Craig, but this would be a perfect bounce back chance versus Trev, and that's exactly what happened, with Peter dominating the match, winning the game 20-9, and looking at a huge game versus Josh in round 3. Next, we would have Sammy versus Mike, another fairly boring match, even though Mike has a tendency to play every game close, no matter how good or bad the player is. But for the first time in Mike's history, this time he would get completely destroyed, with Sammy looking solid and winning the match 20-8 overall. Round 2 has been full of lopsided, boring matches, and this next match was only one of 2. Lopsided. Generally, this would be another boring match that we would all pass off, but this would be the most fun match yet. Let me give you guys some backstory. Jason and Adrian, having a great and probably the best rivalry of all time, but that would go even further than just the games they would play each other in. Season 10, Round 3, BO2, Adrian versus Frosty. Adrian would get the best single game performance up to 20 kills of all time, winning the match 20-4. But only 1 round later, Jason would shatter that, beating Dan 20-1 in the quarterfinals, setting the new single game record. Adrian would now see the perfect opportunity to break that, but there was only one way to break that. Adrian would get the only ever shutout in sniping tournament history, beating Jason's record and proving to be one of the most sad losses in history, especially for a guy that bought all this gaming equipment for this tournament. Dan would be eliminated, and Adrian would clinch the playoffs with a huge match versus Jason next. Our next match would be the best of round 2, with a game with a divisional title on the line and a playoff spot, with Josh versus Craig. These two had a legendary match once before, with the two playing all the way back in Season 1, with Josh, who was the best sniper in the group at the time, beating Craig 20-14. with Taher selling Josh out. Now, 10 seasons later, they would rematch, but this would be a lot different than back then. Craig, coming off his best win of his career, while Josh barely beat Trev, but Josh would still be the favorite to win this, and would need to prove why he isn't a tournament choker. Josh playing another horrible game, but this time in a losing effort. Craig was starting to get people annoyed with his Craig card tactics, hence why the car is named now after him. But Craig would now make his second straight playoff appearance, and Josh would be playing Peter in the next round for a playoff spot. Our last match for round 2 would be another fairly boring one, with Gabe versus Matosh. Gabe, looking really sharp versus Trayvon in round 1, was looking for a playoff spot of his own, and would have the perfect opportunity versus Matosh. Matosh, coming off a 20-4 loss versus Chris C, would really need a prayer to even think about the playoffs. Matosh would finally come through, making a huge comeback, being down 17-14, with Gabe abusing the Craig car, but Matosh would fight back in this one and would tie it up 19-19, camping its spawn a little, but showing to be a smart player, winning the game in a crazy upset to now suddenly have a chance of a playoff spot. Gabe, getting cocky a little too early, would mess him up in this one. Round 2 had some crazy twists. Chris C, still being the 1 seed, looking incredible in this tournament and better than he's ever been before. Adrian would be the 2 seed, coming off a 20-0 victory. Jason, shortly behind, but one of them would be knocked down a peg as they were both playing each other. Christian, still a 4th seed. Craig, shockingly, a 5th seed and one of the bigger plot twists in this tournament, but the next few will have to fight their way in the playoffs, well, for some of them at least. Gabe, the current 6th seed, but seeing as he plays Chris C in the next round, his path to the playoffs will be quite harder than the rest. Sammy, the current 7th seed, will almost be a lock for the playoffs, as Alex forfeits. As for Peter and Josh, both the 8th and 9th seed currently, will both actually be playing each other for a spot in the playoffs. Winner is in, and loser is out. Matosh, a 10 seed, would need to beat Trayvon and hope for 2 of the 4 between Gabe, Sammy, Josh, and Peter to lose. Round 3 begins, and a lot of playoff stakes are on the line. Speaking of a huge playoff game, and a huge game in general, easily the most anticipated regular season game of the year and the best rivalry of all time, we have Jason versus Adrian playing yet again. Adrian being a small favorite in this game, as he was still the best player in the tournament as of now, even though Chris C is having the best season. But Jason is 4-2 in the rivalry as of now, with most of their games being close, and especially the last game the two played in BO2. Another classic was on the way. Adrian came with a vengeance this time, camping in the same room Jason did for the first kill, taunting Jason and BMing him the whole game, and dominating the game, letting the lead slip a little at the end, but Adrian with this win wins the division, and now either gets seeds 1, 2, or 3, depending on how Christian and Chris C do, while Jason will almost surely be a 5 seed and look to play Craig in the quarterfinals. Our next match of round 3 was a game with 0 playoff implications, but a fun game that people have been waiting for a while. Dan versus Matt R. Dan coming off back-to-back terrible losses, losing 20-0 against Adrian and was fairly hopeless for the season, but shockingly being a favorite as Matt R has barely played COD compared to Dan, who is constantly playing COD with the group. Either way, we were in for a fun game. And Dan just keeps on getting worse. Dan, after training lots over the offseason, buying $1,000+ worth of gaming equipment, would go 0-3 in the tournament, and his final tournament ever. The game would be close as expected the whole way through, but Matt R would take it at the buzzer, winning 20-17. It's officially a wrap on the Hail Marys division, and the next division to be finished was the Finesse Gods. This division has been a very boring and one-sided division, and Christian would look to cap off a 3 or a 2 seed, most likely depending on how this game versus Mike was. Christian was a massive favorite in this one, as Mike has been awful this season. Should be a cakewalk for Christian, right? What just happened? Mike would do what he infamously does. This would be one of the craziest ones yet. Christian, who is one of the GOATs, would show that he is rusty on controller in this one, not looking like the dominant player we know him as, almost losing to Mike. In fact, Mike was even winning 14-11 and even 18-17 in one of the more shocking games in the entire tournament, but Christian would clutch up to secure the win 20-18, getting a 3 seed as a lock almost, but really needing to unrust fast before the playoffs. Our next game was a match that didn't have much playoff implications, as Craig was almost locked in as the 4th seed as he had the worst KD of all division winners, and Trev having a super low chance at the playoffs. Either way, this should be an easy win for Craig to get some momentum going in the playoffs, as Trev is still winless in his career. Oh my god. Craig, now losing against Dan and Trev in his career. Trev. Like, what can I even say? Trev actually looked solid in this game, shockingly, and has been the only one in history to actually make Craig stop going to the Craig car, as Trev was actually countering it perfectly. Craig would still be a 4 seed after this game, but this would make Craig super vulnerable, and a most likely easy out against Jason in the quarterfinals, as Trev, of all people, was the one to beat him. What a twist. 3 games left of the regular season, and all having massive playoff implications. And our first one was a good match. Chris C versus Gabe. The task is simple for Gabe. Win and end the playoffs. Lose, and there's a good chance he misses the playoffs, unless Matosh also loses his game. The issue with that is he is playing Chris C, who has easily been the best player in the tournament so far, having 40 kills and 8 deaths, looking absurdly dominant. This would be a tough task for Gabe, but he would need this one for his playoff life. And with this loss, Gabe, after having a massive chance to make the playoffs after round 1, suddenly has a really low chance of making it. But he's not out yet. As for Chris C, he has clinched the 1 seed, and has his best chance of finally getting the ring he's always wanted, as he has looked godlike in this tournament. All he has to do is win. Matosh, who people would have laughed at after his 20-4 round 1 loss versus Chris C if he said he was going to make the playoffs. But now, it is right here, in his hands. All he has to do is win, and Trayvon is the only player in his way. After all these years of getting stomped by Hall of Fame snipers, his best chance is right here. And Matosh, in unbelievable fashion, has made a complete 180 and is a now guaranteed 8th seed in the playoffs. Though it was an easy win for Matosh, Trayvon started the game up 5-1, with Matosh potentially shaking off some nerves, but it was all Matosh after that, taking over the mid and late game to win the match 20-13 in his most impressive win of all time, to play Chris C in a rematch in the quarterfinals. It was all locked in. Chris C, the 1 seed, Adrian, the 2 seed, Christian, the 3 seed, Craig, 4, Jason, 5, Sammy, 7, and Matosh, 8. The 6th seed was wide open, and the last match of the regular season would determine who would play Christian in the playoffs in round 1, Peter versus Josh. Peter, the reigning champion, and a very small favorite to win this game, has had one good and one bad game, and has been looking better overall lately. But Josh, the OG best player, a great player in his past, but a player who has always choked in tournaments, would finally have his chance to prove that he is still a top sniper. Who would make it in, and who would be eliminated? Josh playing a disgustingly bad game, but still made it close later on, but Peter would completely take over the endgame, winning the match 20-14 to make a playoff appearance and defend his title still. This is the most disappointing loss for Josh since his loss versus Sammy in Season 4, and probably Josh's most disappointing loss ever. The playoffs were here, and we were in for a fun time, the new brackets taking effect. All games were best of 3s. And our first playoff match was Chris C, the 1 seed, versus Matosh, the 8th seed. Matosh, the miracle man of the tournament, starting the tournament losing 20-4 to Chris C himself, but clawing his way back into the playoffs, winning 20-19 versus Gabe in round 2, and 20-13 versus Trayvon. But after all, Chris C was the player that had beat him bad before, and Chris C has just looked godly in this tournament. But Matosh has improved a lot since that round 1 game. Still a massive underdog, but you never know. Yeah, unfortunately, the Cinderella run would end pretty short. Chris C would dominate the entire series, but Matosh did go on a little run in Game 2. He was losing 3-14, and he made it 11-14, getting an 8-kill streak. So that was a cool part of the quarterfinals, but Chris C overall dominated this one pretty hard. Matosh improving a little bit, but I think Chris C was just too good for him. And Chris C keeping his undefeated streak alive. A mini rivalry over the last 2 tournaments, Sammy versus Adrian. In Season 9, these two would play in the finals, which saw Adrian winning the match 30-16, dominating. But Season 10, Adrian would lose versus Sammy in Game 2 of the semifinals, which ultimately eliminated Adrian. But this time was a little different. Though Sammy was in the playoffs as a 7 seed, he kinda lucked his way in this one for the most part, only beating Mike and winning his other off a forfeit, and Adrian has looked very good and still maintaining his best player status, though Chris C was giving him a run for his money. Adrian was a massive favorite in this one, and I'll save you guys the time. Adrian would dominate both games, winning 20-12 in Game 1 and 20-7 in Game 2 to send him to his 4th semifinals appearance in a row and eliminating the great Sammy. Easily the most anticipated game of the quarterfinals, Jason versus Craig. Now Jason is the 5 seed, but he's still a favorite in this series as Craig just came off a loss to Trev, and Craig was just gonna sit behind the Craig car for the entire game as we know. And Jason, though he also just came off a bad loss to Adrian, was still a great player. Now this series had its trash talk, and a lot of viewers for this one as the group was gonna play NBA 2K Pro-Am after the series. Craig has always trash talked Jason and wanted to win this series bad, but it would be a tough task for him. Wow, a good game, we were right. This was a crazy game 1. Jason started the game off really well, even being up 12-7, but Jason wouldn't be doing the comeback this time, as the Craig car was just too much for Jason in this one, as Craig had a great run to get back in this one, but Jason wasn't done yet, and the game would be tied 18-18, but Craig would end the game off winning 20-18 in a shocker, and would need just one more win to move on to his first semifinals after losing to Dan just 2 seasons ago, and Trev just last round. Jason would finally warm up, destroying Craig in this one, showing glimmers of prime Jason. This would be massive for Jason, as all the momentum was on his side now, and he would just need to finish the job in Game 3 to play Chris C in the semifinals and have their long-awaited rematch. And this would go down as an amazing series. A great win for the infamous car camper Craig, and a very disappointing loss for Jason. Craig starting the game off so well, going up 6-1, and Jason would have to claw his way back into the game, playing from behind for the entire game, but Jason missing an easy shot from behind, down 13-17 to make it 13-18, was the nail in the coffin, though Jason would almost make another infamous comeback, but would come up short, losing 20-16, and Craig would move on to play Chris C in the semifinals. Lastly, we had a fairly decent series with Peter versus Christian, though Christian was a pretty solid favorite in this one. Peter, the reigning champ, wasn't a higher seed in this one, and would have a tough match in Christian. Even though Christian has looked a little shaky in this tournament so far, but after all, this is one of the GOATs in Christian that we are talking about, and surely he would get his groove going at some point. And let's just cut to the chase. Christian looked really sharp in this series, destroying the reigning champion in both games, looking like his groove is almost back, but not quite in prime form just yet, like we saw when he destroyed Will. But Christian, looking very good, would move on to the semifinals to play Adrian in the most anticipated game of the entire tournament. Our final four. 3 of the 4 players were expected to be here, though Jason was also expected to be playing Chris C, but instead, we have our first match of the semifinals. Craig versus Chris C. 2 completely different players. Craig, a player who, like many before, mainly players like Watch Trout, would get really far in a tournament from doing what players would describe as a cheap tactic, such as camping hard, and in Craig's case, camping hard behind the Craig car, but like many before, once you run into a great player, camping won't win you a game, but would it in this case? Craig had a great run in this tournament, but Chris C was simply on a different level in this tournament. Chris C was very good, but also very smart in this tournament. Chris C in school before this match would talk to Will and ask for advice on how to deal with Craig, and ultimately they both decided that the best way to beat Craig is to use his own strategy against him and take over the very same car that got Craig here in the first place. Now Craig started off game 1 up 4-0, but the second Chris C got control of that car, it was night-night for Craig, and Chris C would move on to his second ever finals appearance to play the winner of Christian versus Adrian. Probably the most anticipated match in the last 3 tournaments, Christian versus Adrian, 2 Hall of Fame, top 5 snipers, and in Christian's case, top 2 or 1. This was the series of the ages, and in typical Adrian fashion, this series came with a little trash talk. In the video of Christian versus Mike in round 3 of this tournament, Adrian would leave a comment saying, "I have an easy path to the finals," insinuating that his side of the bracket would be an easy out and that he would beat Sammy and Christian easily. Also, in our fantasy football group chat, Adrian would talk a ton of trash in that too, and this was gonna be a good one. It is safe to say Christian is back. Adrian was stunned at how the beginning of the game went, going down 10-2. Adrian would finally wake up and make an incredible comeback, but it was too little too late, and Christian would eventually close it out 20-17. But Adrian had a lot of momentum going at the end of the game, and would need to really carry that into game 2. But this would be a tough task, as Christian is completely undefeated on the map Nuketown, on this game and BO3 in tournaments. Adrian would get back on track in this one, giving the great Christian his only Nuketown loss ever, and completely switching the series up and dominating Christian in this one, and taunting on top of that to win the match 20-11 and set us up for an epic Game 3 thriller between the two legends. This was one of the most grueling matches of all time. I can explain. Adrian, continuing his momentum from last game, would start off well, going up 7-5, but then Christian would completely go off, getting 6 straight kills in a row to make it 11-7, completely switching the momentum. Then, after that, Adrian would get a few kills of his own to make the game 11-9, but then after that, it's like we were in slow motion. Both players would really want this win and were playing really tactically. This match would be the longest match ever, lasting 48 minutes. Yes, 48 minutes. I'm not even kidding, 48 minutes. Dan even had to go to bed in the middle of this match. This match would go back and forth for a while, and eventually the score would be 17-16 Christian. After this is where most of the time would occur, because it was around 15 minutes of game time between 17-16, and when Christian would ultimately, in very impressive fashion, win the game and series 20-16 to move on to his second straight finals to play Chris C. It wasn't over yet though. There was tons of trash talk in our fantasy football group chat, both accusing each other of camping, but ultimately it was Christian who won the series and Adrian would be going home. And finally, the longest and one of the most difficult tournaments to set up would be coming to a close, and we were left with the great finals match coming up. Christian versus Chris C. Two great snipers who were hungry for a championship and would have one best of 3 series to get it. Now these two have actually played before in the Season 5 semifinals, which was actually Christian's last tournament before this one, and as we all know, that season was the best single season performance from anyone, and in that game, Christian would completely destroy Chris C in that game, 30-10, but it's been a long road since, and that was when Chris C was still a young, developing sniper, and now Chris C, after having many ups and downs in his long career, making 5 semifinals appearances and 1 finals appearance in his career, losing to Jacob in awful fashion in the Season 6 finals, losing 30-14, but Chris C was a new man, looking completely unstoppable in this tournament, not only winning all of his games, but not even having a close game, and even in non-tournament 1v1s, Chris C was completely undefeated. Even though he didn't play versus Christian, Will, or Adrian in those matches, it was still Chris C as a decent favorite in this one. But on the other side, it was Christian. Now Christian would have a fairly interesting run in this tournament. Christian would start this tournament off slow, which was expected after his long time off from playing on controller, but Christian, even with his slow start, would still win his matches. Christian would have his first big test in playing Adrian, and would look like his prime self in that, aside from Game 2. And that is scary. If Christian could perform like Prime Christian, there's almost nobody that could beat him, and this would be a legacy-making match for both players. Christian, who is now locked in as at least a top 2 sniper and potentially number 1, would look godlike yet again, making Chris C, who had gone completely undefeated and dominating everyone, look awful, absolutely destroying him in both games, giving Chris C deja vu of when they played back in Season 5. Christian was inevitable, earning his 2nd championship in back-to-back seasons for Christian, and this one would be potentially even more impressive for him than his last one. After taking a long break from controller, he would come back and win a tournament on an input he doesn't even main. Pure greatness. Well, I hope you all enjoyed that video, and it's time to get into the very elite awards. The best match / series, and I guess I'd spoil a little bit there, but the best match of the tournament goes to the Christian vs. Adrian semifinal series. Now, there was a few options I could have put here. I could have put Jason vs. Craig quarterfinals here, or I could have put the Gabe vs. Mattosh round 2 matchup here, but the reason I opted to go with Christian vs. Adrian is, number 1, just the caliber of these 2 snipers. These 2 snipers are definitely all-time greats. I mean, obviously, Christian is probably the best or 2nd best sniper of all time, and Adrian is, at worst, a top 5 sniper. You could debate that he's the 3rd best sniper of all time, and obviously, Christian's underdog, I mean, it wasn't like the biggest underdog story, but it definitely was an underdog story considering that Christian took a large break from controller, came back, and then beat a player like Adrian in the semifinals. And by the way, if you were watching this game live, I know the edited footage of it makes it look short, but oh boy, it was not short. The entire series was well over an hour. Game 3 alone was 48 minutes. I think it was like 48 minutes and 34 seconds. I don't have the exact time up here, but Game 3 was so long, and because both snipers were kind of playing a bit tactical for sure, both really wanting to win. Game 2 wasn't very long because Adrian was playing super aggressive, which he probably should have stuck to that strategy, honestly, but he didn't. And Christian got the better of him for sure in Game 1 and in Game 3, especially Game 1. I think, honestly, in Game 1, Christian came out really strong and shocked Adrian, and Adrian tried to make a little comeback in that game, and he honestly got pretty close, but Christian was able to take it away. But overall, I think this series went really back and forth. Just 2 all-time great snipers going at it. It can't get much better than that. The other matches, Jason vs. Craig, was very good. That was a very good series as well. But I think just from the caliber of snipers, I would put Christian and Adrian above Jason vs. Craig. And then Gabe vs. Mattosh, also very good, 20-19. But it was a little bit earlier in the year. Don't get me wrong, it was a very key game for the playoffs. So you could make the argument that's here, that's fine, but for me, I'm going to go with the Christian vs. Adrian semifinal series. The best underdog story of the tournament goes to Mattosh. Now, I'll make this clear, this is another one that a few snipers could have gotten. I'll name them right now. Obviously, as we just talked about, Christian definitely could have won this award, but the only reason I didn't give it to Christian here is because he's already known as a great, like I said, I'll always keep saying this, like top 1 or 2 sniper, right? So even though, yes, he was an underdog compared to like Adrian or Chris C, he was still the 3rd favorite to win it, and like everyone knew he was super good, and it was just a matter of like, can he shake off the rust in time or not? And obviously he did, right? But Mattosh before this, I believe, only had 1 career win, and really wasn't even expected to win a game, but he won 2 games, a crazy nail-biter against Gabe, and then destroying Trayvon in the game after to make a playoff run after losing 20-4 against Chris C. And by the way, the 3rd player that could have won this is Craig, but I'll go over that in a second on why I wouldn't give it to Craig. But anyways, yeah, I'm going to give this one to Mattosh, just because he kind of came out of nowhere and wasn't even expected to make the playoffs, while Christian, at worst in this tournament, was expected to lose in the semifinals. So I think Mattosh, I'm going to give the edge over everyone else for the underdog story. And Craig did make a quarterfinals last year, so the jump from quarterfinals to semifinals isn't as crazy. And also, I think Mattosh did it just from pure skill. And, I mean, I'm not knocking what Craig did, you know, you gotta use strategy to win, but I'm just gonna give Mattosh the edge over Craig in this one as well. Like I said, Craig, you could give it to Craig or Christian, honestly, in this one, but I think Mattosh is the best answer for the biggest underdog story of the tournament. The most loved sniper of the tournament goes to Christian. Now, I mean, there's a few options I could have given to this, but I think Christian definitely deserves this award, and it's in the same sense as, like, back in Season 2, Fation won it because people respected his underdog story, like, you know, because in Season 2, Fation was obviously new to sniping tournaments, and people didn't really know who he was or how good he was, and he was able to beat me and COD Ghost and earn a championship, and people just respected, like, how good he was. And it's kind of the same thing in this. I think people just had a really fond respect of Christian in this because of how impressive this tournament win was. So I think for that, Christian deserves this award. I guess usually I would give this to Sammy, but honestly, Sammy wasn't too active in this tournament or on the game. So this one probably isn't going to Sammy. I mean, Sammy's still obviously loved, right? But yeah, for this reason, I'm going to give the most loved sniper of the tournament to Christian. The most hated sniper of the tournament, and now I said Adrian is basically a gimme for these awards, but this is going to be a little bit of a plot twist. This is going to go to Craig. Now, Craig was a trash talker. He was a big trash talker, and unlike Adrian, Craig, skill-wise, didn't have enough to really back it up, but it would just be very annoying for people going against him to just lose against him, and all he was doing is sitting behind, which is known as the Craig car. And everyone hated Craig for doing the strategy, or at least I'm not going to say everyone, but most people were definitely just sick of it, and obviously the strategy was talking, mainly to Jason and Peter and stuff like that, obviously, but yeah, no, people did not like Craig at all in this tournament just because of the strategy, and just because of how effective it was for him. I mean, he made a semifinals appearance just by doing the strategy, and for that reason alone, people hated him, even more than Adrian, though Adrian, honestly, you could give it a co-award to Craig and Adrian, but I think I'm going to give Craig the slight advantage here, and, you know, Adrian's already, he's a very prestigious winner of this award anyways, so I think it's time to give it to someone new for once, and yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say for that. The most improved player of the tournament goes to Chris C. Now, this is another one of those awards where multiple people could have won it, and I honestly really like these awards for this tournament because it's just where many different players could win it, but for this one, I'm going to give it to Chris C. And before I go over why, I guess I could go over the honorable mentions on who it could be. So I think, honestly, I think Christian could potentially win all these awards, but I think the thing with Christian is he already won the last tournament he was in, so he won in back-to-back tournaments for him already, so I think it's more fair to put someone that like made a bigger jump than he did. Another one you could say Craig, honestly, but once again, I already went over the arguments on why I probably wouldn't give it to Craig. And the best other argument I would say is probably Matosh, just because of what I was saying earlier with the underdog story. But with Chris C, I think in his last two tournaments, he performed below average for him. He lost in round 2 in BO2, and he didn't make the playoffs in his last 2 seasons, right? And he went from that to making a finals appearance in 1 season, and not only making a finals appearance, but actually looking super good and dominant, like he can compete with the top snipers. Obviously, we know what happened to him in the finals, right? But there is levels to this. Christian is just a tier above him, but overall, in his Season 6 finals against Jacob, he kind of, like, slouched his way to the finals and, like, was barely scraping through wins. But with this one, he was just destroying everyone and really looked like a top-notch sniper and just couldn't get the job done in the finals. But overall, when you look at the season for Chris C, it was a remarkable season for him. Easily still his best season of all time. And it's just unfortunate for him that it didn't end the way he wanted to. But overall, I would still give this award to him. The biggest disappointment of the tournament, and I just hate to do this because this player has won it so many times, but it has to be Josh. Now, there's a few other contenders that you can maybe argue deserve this award. The biggest one I would say is Jason, but Jason at least made a playoff appearance. I think the only thing that was super disappointing for him was losing against Craig, when we all know skill-wise he's definitely above Craig, but losing that was definitely disappointing for him. But come on, I think I have to give this to Josh, because he didn't even make the playoffs, and he was the player who used to be the best sniper in our friend group, and going from that to not even making the playoffs is definitely not good. Not only did he not make the playoffs either, but he almost lost against Trev even in round 1, and looked like completely not even close to what he used to be, and losing in dominant fashion to Craig and Peter. Just, he never even showed a flash of his old self. Like, at least in Season 5, Josh looked actually pretty good, and that was, like, the closest resemblance to how good Josh was, like, outside of sniping tournaments. But, yeah, this tournament, I think I just have to give this to Josh, because he was projected to at least make the playoffs, and he completely missed the playoffs, so unfortunately, I have to give this one to Josh. On a competitive scale, I would like to rank this tournament 8 out of 10, which is definitely one of the higher rankings, and I could pretty easily explain why. Majority of people were trying really hard and really thought they had a chance of winning this tournament, and it was one of the few tournaments where that was the case, honestly. And there was a lot of, like, crazy underdog stories. First of all, we could just go over right now. Craig and Matosh, both of them were not even expected to make the playoffs. Both of them did, showing really good grit, and I think that alone is really good. Obviously, having players like Christian Adrian, that's obviously going to help. Especially, I think those two alone just clashing in the semifinals is really good for the competitive scale. So comp-wise, in terms of just like really good snipers in the tournament, it was really good. Obviously, we had Chris C, who was super good as well in this tournament. Jason and Peter, they definitely had to fall off in this tournament, though they were still decent threats in this tournament. It was just unfortunate both of them didn't really get any playoff success in this. I mean, to be fair, Peter played Christian. In Jason's case, I mean, he probably should have beaten Craig, but unfortunately he did it. Obviously, Jason's and Peter's drive in this tournament wasn't as huge because they had already both won, so their motivation definitely wasn't as high as maybe some other people like Chris C. But overall, definitely this is an 8 out of 10. A lot of people wanted to win. This is a really hype game, really hype tournament in our friend group, so definitely an 8 out of 10 for me on the competitive scale. On a fun scale, I would like to rank this tournament a 7 out of 10. Now, this tournament, once again, it was a fun tournament, honestly, just as a watcher. I will say there's one thing, and this is just a hosting POV. This was by far one of the hardest, if not the hardest tournament to set up. I think going for 16 players, looking back at it, was definitely a stretch. And it was really hard, especially for those earlier matches. Once we got to the playoffs, it was pretty easy to set up the matches, but I will tell you, in the regular season, it was super hard to set up the matches. So I think that's the only thing, at least for me as a host, that was definitely a bit of a dimmer, but definitely from a watching POV, this tournament was super fun. A lot of close games. In terms of upsets, we definitely had a few good upsets as well, a few comebacks as well. So overall, I mean, this tournament had a lot to it, and then, you know, obviously the favorites not winning it, like Christian, it was definitely one of the most impressive, if not the most impressive tournament win of all time from Christian's POV, and that alone was just enjoyable to watch. So yeah, overall, from a watching POV, I have really not much complaints, honestly. I mean, the finals, I kind of wish the finals was a little more competitive, a little bit more close, but at this point, it's a theme for the finals to be kind of bad, so I can't even really expect much from the finals. So yeah, no, it was a fun tournament to watch, and for that, I'll rank it a 7 out of 10. On an overall scale, I would like to rank this tournament an 8 out of 10, which places it at 4th best of all time. Now, really quick, I just want to go over the bad things about this tournament before I get into all the good stuff. So for me, I think the main bad thing about this tournament is when you look at the playoffs, there was only really 2 series that made the playoffs good and that were actually like competitive series. And one of them was of course, the Craig versus Jason quarterfinals. That was a super good series. And then, of course, the best one, Christian versus Adrian in the semifinals. But really, when you look outside of those 2 series in the playoff bracket, you don't have any really good matches, and the rest of them are just 2-0 sweeps that really aren't competitive in any game. Like, in the quarterfinals, we had Chris C versus Matosh. Chris C dominated 2-0. Sammy versus Adrian in the quarterfinals. Adrian dominated that 2-0. Christian versus Peter in the quarterfinals. Christian dominated that 2-0. Dominated both games. All those games dominated for all those players. And then in the semifinals, for the other side, we had Chris C versus Craig. And Chris C won 2-0, dominating in both games. And, of course, the finals itself was definitely one of the biggest disappointments. And for that reason, I think that's probably the worst thing about the tournament. Other than that, this tournament is really good. I would say one of the best things easily about this tournament is the divisions and bracket system, which was new at the time, and a big change up from the just normal double elimination bracket that I already went over the amount of flaws that it had. So I think that was super refreshing and brought a new sense of competitive nature with the division system. And I think that part of it alone was super fun. We had a lot of course, plot twists in this tournament, and I think that makes for just a good overall tournament. And, you know, we had, of course, our close games. We had, I think, definitely, you know, the Matosh versus Gabe one was not only a close game, but a big plot twist. And that's pretty much it. I don't really have much complaints on watching the tournament. It was super competitive. A lot of people were trying to win. Christian's underdog story was super good to watch in this tournament, and it was definitely, it's definitely really fun to watch that. So I think that alone, just, you know, him coming back on controller after all those years and still winning, and especially in dominant fashion in the finals, super impressive. Probably, like I said, probably one of the most, if not the most impressive run of all time. And yeah, for that, I'm going to rank it 8 out of 10, and it's the 4th best sniping tournament of all time. Now, the best moment / my personal favorite moment, and I gotta say, I'm going to give this to 2 awards, but I'm going to really emphasize this one. I'm going to give it to 1 award, but I'm going to make the other one an honorable mention. Now, the honorable mention I would like to go over is the nail-biting game versus Matosh and Gabe. Now, that was a really, really good moment overall. And that was definitely I think the best comeback of the tournament, with Matt Tosh coming from behind to win that game. And definitely a super impressive underdog story for that one. But this kind of hurts, and it's just, you know, the best moment of this tournament is 20-0. Now, this is a historical landmark of a moment. It's the only skunk in sniping tournament history, and it's just, I mean, Dan, I hate to say it, but he had a lot of bad moments, a lot of, like, you know, epic fail kind of moments, and this was definitely the peak of those moments. And then it's just one of those moments that we can't really, like, forget or live down, and it's definitely one of the moments from this tournament that we still think about. So it's just a classic. I don't have much to say about it. I don't have a really great reason on why this is the best moment of the tournament, but it just is. It's a classic. 20-0, the only skunk in sniping tournament history, and for that, it is the best moment of the tournament. So I will see you guys in, I don't know what. I think I might do a season 13 retrospective video. I might do that, and it's actually been a year from now, which is crazy how time flies by so fast. But yeah, it's been a whole year from that, so I probably will do a season 13 video, and I'll see you guys for that one.